Ezzeldeen Masri, Nimrod Dweck. This is Daniel Lubetzky. I'm better known as the founder of Kind, but a lot of people have been surprised that they don't know that 30 years ago, I started working very, very hard in the Middle East, first starting a company called Peaceworks to build business, to shatter stereotypes and cement relationships, and then partnering first with US, then with Nimrod, but certainly over 20 years ago, building a movement of Israelis and Palestinians, trying to amplify their voice and seize back the agenda for conflict resolution. And Nimrod is the head of Darkenu, and he was one of the founders of many very interesting things which he will share. He runs and oversees Democrat TV in Israel. Ezzeldeen and I have been working. He comes from Gaza, and he was the head of the Gaza office of the OneVoice movement. And now you're currently based in Chicago. We had to evacuate Ezzeldeen a while back because his life was threatened. Would you like to give yourselves a quick introduction? We decided to do this because we feel that people are not understanding what's going on, and having known Ezzeldeen for a long time, he and I don't agree on everything. Probably Nimrod and I also don't agree on everything, but I think our framework of how to resolve this conflict and what's it going to take and listening to one another is just not happening. And I want to just start with one last thing before I give you guys the floor to introduce yourselves. It's fascinating to me, and I've been noticing this for 20, 30 years, but it's worse now with social media. Like, the Jewish, Israeli, Western supporters of Israel are all having this conversation, and the Arab, Muslim, Palestinian supporters are having this conversation, and they are not seeing the same facts. And it's even worse now because there's so much misinformation. Social media people all have different opinions and not a lot of facts. And it is, we're going to start with that. So I want to talk about the hospital that got blown up and understand their different narratives. But and Nimrod, could you introduce yourselves briefly?
Yes. Ezzeldeen Masri, Palestinian American. I come from Beit Lahia. It's a village in the northwest of the Gaza Strip. I first came to the state in 1990 to study, finished bachelor degree and master degree in political science, specialized in conflict resolution and peace building. 2006, November 2006, I opened the office of OneVoice Gaza in Gaza City, Rimal district, Amr al-Mukhtar Street. And my mandate was to explain to the people, Palestinian people in Gaza in Arabic, that the conflict with Israel needs to end through negotiation, leading to a negotiated two-state solution. I also ran a leadership development program for university students and youth in Gaza. And as Daniel said, I witnessed the war of 2008, 2012, and in 2014. With the help of OneVoice and the American Embassy, I was evacuated with my family back to Chicago, where I started in 2015 a program called OneVoice on Campus to address the issue of polarization on American campuses when it comes to Israel-Palestine.
Yes, and am I right that you and I know each other even before 2006? Because I seem to recall that you were also working with us before we opened the office in Gaza.
Yeah.
And we started working, you were either a staff member, a contractor, or a colleague, but I remember...
Yeah, I was a volunteer prior to 2006. I helped with OneVoice Ramallah in Gaza, and upon you contacting me and coming to my house in Gaza in November 2006, I assumed the leadership of OneVoice in Gaza, opening the office and running the operation in there. Yes.
Yeah, and I was in Gaza with you, and I have been in Gaza a few times before, I think, before I met you. And then at some point we should talk a little bit about some of the experiences we had, our last meeting or non-meeting in Gaza, which is very interesting and sobering. Nimrod, do you mind introducing yourself briefly?
Sure. Nimrod Dweck, I'm 42. I'm living at the time which is by Tel Aviv in Israel. I entered the civic society or the civic engagement field First as a youth leader in the Israeli Scouts, and then I became a musician. I was a rapper for about a decade of my life, and then I shifted into marketing. And when I started doing marketing, my favorite clients were social movements, mostly in the field of peace or in the field of environment. And that's what I did for several years. In 2015, end of 2014, I founded a movement called V15 with a colleague of mine called Itamar, which became the largest grassroots movement in the country to mobilize people to vote. And we want to change the government from the extreme right government to anything else that could be. We didn't succeed, but the experience was so intense that we created a new movement based on that called Darkenu, which is a movement that comes to amplify the voices of the moderates. It says there is a new identity category in the Israeli society, which are moderates, liberal moderates, people who adhere to the same values. They talk about, human rights and about being human and opening your ears and listening to different narratives and walk towards solutions, and not just, keep having these two sides battling without any solution. I've been the VP strategy, field manager, digital manager, anything for the past 7 years in it. We've done multiple get out the vote campaigns for elections. We did campaigns against the annexation. We did campaigns for the future of the Gaza Strip, by the way, about 7 years ago, and so on. And that's my civic background in a way, or so. I'm more like let's say, if I need to look at different actors in the field, I'm very much the average Israeli who got into the event and said, this is our moment to take responsibility on our time. And that's what I try to do in Darkenu, what we're still trying to do.
It's a very modest way to introduce yourself. I know you've done a ton more, but thank you. I do want to clarify a couple of things for anybody that's listening. The OneVoice movement was founded around 2000. The thought was in my mind around between 2000 and 2002, 2003. I started seeing the intellectual framework for it. I think we should get to it in a little bit for what is it and why did it get started. But its goal, in Mohammed Darawshe and I, who Mohammed was just recently, he recently met President Biden, like I think yesterday, because his cousin was killed by Hamas terrorists trying to heal other people that were wounded at the Music Peace Festival. And this is what people don't seem to understand. Awad Darawshe was Muslim, and he was killed by the Hamas terrorists. A number of people that were killed by the Hamas terrorists were Muslims, were Palestinians. They have no regard for life. Ezzeldeen will be able to share where he agrees or disagrees with that statement. But and I'm sorry if people hear there's some construction here. I hope that can you guys see that or no? But OneVoice, when it was built, it was a non-partisan movement, and from the years 2002 through 2014, it had members from all political parties working with us. Around 2014, a number of generals and heads of security and from all the retired heads of all of the different Israeli security services told us what's happening with Netanyahu is very scary. They saw this 10 years before we are today. Like, they saw it way before everybody else. And they're like, you need to help these young people at V15 and these other people, these commanders for Israeli security. So for the first time in OneVoice's history, OneVoice agreed to help V15 and commanders for Israel security and others in what became a campaign for change that almost succeeded in taking Netanyahu out of power. And for me, what's interesting is Netanyahu made me enemy number one. He said that he and that I and Danny Abraham and others were sinister anti-Zionists, which is, by the way, not true. I am very proudly pro-Israel. I'm also very proudly pro-Palestinian. I believe the only way to fulfill a future for the Jewish people, for the Israeli people, for the Muslim people, for the Christian people, for the Palestinian people, is to build a future that's better for everybody. Otherwise, we're going to continue killing each other. And I'm not Republican or a Democrat or a left versus right. I'm very idiosyncratic. I have a little bit of the Rabin philosophy that you should fight terror as if there's no peace, and you should pursue peace if there's no terror, because you cannot let the Islamic Republic repressing the people in Iran and funding all of these spoilers derail your efforts. I mean, as they've successfully done right now. But anyway, I wanted to just highlight how OneVoice ended up then becoming supporting V15 and then leading to the merger to create Darkenu thereafter. And Darkenu, very importantly, whereas V15 is associated as a movement that was coming from the left, Darkenu's worked really, really hard to come from the center right. Is that fair, Nimrod?
Yeah. Today, when you ask the common Israeli what is Darkenu, I just came from the playground, and someone asked me what I'm doing, and I said, "What is what I'm doing?" So Darkenu, those right wingers, like the
but
position.
It's the wrong framework. This is the most important thing people need to understand. Is that politicians want to try to make it sound like we're left or right, which it's not. It's a movement of values. It's a values movement, and it's not left versus right. I very firmly feel it cannot be Jew versus Muslim. Even though right now there's a lot of hatred between the Jews and the Muslims, we're playing into the extremist hands. The extremists want us to hate one another, want Palestinians to hate Israelis, and that's only playing with the violent absolutists whose vision is an absolute solution that denies the humanity of the other side. That's literally the definition of what OneVoice is. Can you talk to how you see what happened with the hospital in Gaza, just starting with the hottest thing that just happened, and then we'll go back a little bit to the history of what is Hamas, how did it get power, what's been happening in Gaza, and your vision.
Yes, of course. So it's called the Baptist Hospital. It's called the English Hospital. It's called the Ahli Hospital. And it's the oldest hospital in all the Gaza City. And it was built by the British when they first came in during World War II, occupied Gaza. In Ma'amadani, the Baptist Hospital. People started to flee their house in northern Gaza and in East Gaza, the area by the border, and they took refuge in this hospital, thinking that it's a hospital and it's safe. So you're talking about approximately more than 1,000 people who were in this hospital, in the backyard, in the front yard of the hospital, families sleeping. And of course, you have doctors and patients in the hospital. And apparently, it was bombed. And 500 people lost their lives. Civilians, babies, men, women, old people, doctors died. And Gazans blame Israel for bombing the hospital, and Israel is saying that the rocket came from Gaza, particularly from Jihad al-Islam organization, and it derailed and it bombed the hospital, and people died. So now we have two stories. We have the Palestinian version of the bombing of the Baptist hospital, and we have the Israeli version of bombing the hospitals. And in my opinion, I think it's not. There is no room for speculation. There is a forensic evidence. Okay, there need to be investigation by a professional team that needs to go examine the crater, look for the fragments of the rockets, and then we'll know if the rockets is made by Israel, made by the U.S., or homemade in Gaza. But until then,
who will go in and do that?
For example, the United Nations.
You think it will happen?
Without that happen, then the blame is between the Jihad Islami and Israel, and we cannot just point finger and accuse.
No, but what frustrates you, Ezzeldeen and I have been having this conversation via WhatsApp over the last couple of days. Like, Ezzeldeen sent to me harrowing videos and of what the reaction was in the Arab world, like thousands marching to the Israeli embassy in Jordan and trying to destroy it, thousands destroying a Jewish synagogue in Tunisia, which had nothing to do with this. It's a Jewish synagogue. The Jewish people had in Tunisia been there for hundreds or thousands of years, had nothing to do, destroying and burning to the ground a Jewish synagogue. Thousands marching in, I think, Lebanon to burn the American embassy, like huge thing. And a lot of misreporting. And for a person that is, from my narrative standpoint, from what I see, there's plenty of evidence. There's videos that's showing that Islamic Jihad video misfired. There's audio that they grabbed from intelligence services that showed that two Hamas militants were saying that it was probably an Islamic Jihad misfire, that it didn't look like it was Israeli. There is other geolocational stuff and the size of the crater and things. And by the way, even though every loss of life is painful, and I really do say that, I hate hearing that Palestinians get killed. First and foremost, I personally assign the blame to Hamas because they're the ones that went and killed the Israelis so ruthlessly. But I also think that in this case, it was Islamic Jihad. Tell me how you see it and how, not just you, because you and I at least have the ability to talk to each other, how does the average Arab see it? Because I don't think they even, does Al Jazeera show any of this? Does Al Manara or any of these other anti-Israel media sources show any of this stuff?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, Jazeera from the first second assigned the blame on Israel. Wael al-Dahdouh, the Jazeera correspondent in Gaza, he was at the site and he came out and he said it was the Israeli that bombed the hospital and with a special.
Would any evidence change the narrative? Because for me, one of the things that I want to talk about today is not just, I think it was, I'm pretty convinced it was Islamic Jihad, but most people on the Arab side,
yeah,
are pretty convinced it was
of course
Israel. And will that ever change? Even with the forensic thing, would that ever change? Because I think that's one of the biggest problems, that there's not enough of what we're having talking to each other. We're just talking to our own people.
Yeah.
Even if the forensic thing happened, would Al Jazeera accurately report? Like, I feel like the damage is done. And even if it was Islamic Jihad, the Arab and Muslim people overwhelmingly won't ever hear that.
I'm really disappointed with the Palestinian narrative on this because I'm a man of science and I would have liked to see empirical evidence. I would have liked to see them immediately on the site, showing the craters, showing the fragments, made in the USA, made in Israel, without them having that evidence. It's not going to be easy to prove that Israel did it. And also the site now has been tampered with, even if you're going to send like a specialized mission to examine the site, international one, the site has been tampered with.
Be fair to, if you disagree, yes, Nimrod, go ahead.
No, I want to say that there are a lot of evidence, by the way, even also the video by Al Jazeera that show the opposite narrative. And also the IDF released a conversation by Hamas activists saying this is a jihad Islamic rocket. And I think the main question of the topic isn't who's to blame. There is a situation, it happened, it's a tragedy, yes. And it happened because of a war. And we need to discuss what do we do from this point, because there are always casualties, yes, in war. I think there was no military operation that, there was the Kfar Kana disaster in Lebanon in the past. Yes. It was in Bethlehem, I think, also a very big disaster. And every military operation, there are casualties that no one wants. But
I think it's worse, Nimrod. I think it's worse. I think Hamas has a culture of death. Hamas, there's an interview that just happened between them and somebody interviewed him. I'll post the link in my notes. And they don't care if Palestinians get killed, they think, oh, it's okay, they're going to go to heaven. So they're causing these deaths.
I think it's even worse than that. I think in the bottom line is Hamas is using the population. He conquered the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority. He's using the population as a shield for his own good. He will do everything he can to be on the upper hand in the situation, even if it's, I don't believe there won't be any.
Do you agree with that? Do you agree do you agree that Hamas, because our narrative is, and you and I will have plenty to disagree on, including that when you don't know who, I didn't quite understand Nimrod, but I'm pretty convinced that it was Islamic Jihad.
I'm convinced it's Islamic Jihad, by the way.
I don't think, as from our conversations, you're being kind enough to say, I don't know, but we also know that the vast majority of Muslims and Arabs think it was the Israelis. But let me ask you a question. Do you agree with the statement that Hamas uses civilians to advance its strategies and it doesn't care if it puts civilians in the way?
Of course.
I studied political science, and one of the courses I took was law and terrorism. And it says one man terrorist is another man freedom fighter.
No, you can't say it.
Let him finish. Let him finish, because I think I'm gonna get to him here, because I have personal knowledge of what he lived through.
So that's science. I'm speaking from a scientific point of view. Okay. Hamas is a terrorist organization by concept. Why? Because it uses violence. It uses violence, and it doesn't hesitate to use it against civilian in order to reach its goals. So according to science, Hamas is a terrorist organization. They use terror in order to get to their goal. And Hamas doesn't represent me. And Hamas represents itself. And Hamas doesn't represent the whole Palestinian people in Gaza, 2.3 million. Hamas represents only itself. And in the election of 2005 and 2006 for the Legislative Council and for the presidency, I did not vote for Hamas. And I voted for the Palestinian. And more than half the Gaza Strip also voted for the Palestinian. So Hamas...
This is very important, and I need to pause it, because I've been hearing a lot of reports that talk about how Hamas won in 2006, and it's not accurate. Let's explain what happened, because you and I were doing work on the ground. Hamas actually did not win a majority of the seats. They won a plurality of the seats. Fatah and the other parties divided themselves, and Fatah had the mistake that they had two candidates running against each other in many of these different legislative elections, and they split the vote. And so let's say there was a situation where the Hamas candidate got 40% and the Fatah candidates got 30 and 30, but then the Hamas guy got elected. It was a tragedy of the guy's proportions. First, people were saying Hamas should not be allowed to run because they didn't have the democratic guardrails.
That's my opinion. They shouldn't. They shouldn't have run.
And the Americans
The American pushed him. The American pushed Abbas to allow for Hamas, because the American were thinking that we are going to bring Hamas into the golden cage, and we are going to change Hamas. Okay.
So one of the tragedies in 2006 was that the Americans pushed for Hamas to be included when people on the ground felt that they would not be democratic. The second was that Fatah was inept in the way it ran, and it had fielded multiple candidates, and they split the vote, and Hamas got. And the third is that Hamas did not. The presidency was won by President Abbas unquestionably. He got a vast majority of the vote. This was back when people had a lot of hope for him. That's different today. And then Hamas did win a plurality of the candidates. But even then, Hamas was not in power of Gaza. Hamas then, could you just elaborate on what happened?
Yeah, so Hamas asked, was assigned by President Abbas to form the government based on the results of the election. And none of the PLO factions wanted to join Hamas government, to the extent that Hamas established a government on its own. Until now, the United States was, thinking maybe Hamas has changed this and that. So the quartet came, with their demand, recognizing Israel, recognizing signed agreement, renouncing terror and violence, engaging in the peace process. And Hamas said, no, we're not going to recognize Israel. We're not going to engage in the peace process. And personally, then, I was working for the Palestinian Authority. I was working in the Palestinian Diplomatic Corps. I was first secretary in the sector of peace. And Mahmoud al-Zahar, Dr. Mahmoud al-Zahar, became head of, he became the foreign minister. And then he said, the first thing he did, he closed the peace sector. He said, there's no need for the peace sector.
Mahmoud al-Zahar was Hamas.
Yes, he is one of Hamas' first cell. So him and Ahmed Yassin, so he's a very prominent doctor in Gaza and high there with Hamas. So he said, the first thing he did, he closed the peace sector. And he said, we're not going to have peace with Israel. And personally, I left the foreign ministry because I don't want to work with Hamas. And then I went back to work with the American International School. So what I wanted to say is Hamas doesn't represent me, doesn't represent the whole Gaza Strip. They represent themselves and the people who voted for. Plus, Hamas did not ask our, like now, Netanyahu wants to go to Gaza, okay? He needs to get the approval of
Before you go there, could you just, for our public, educate us on two more things? If there had been elections a month ago, what do you, roughly, would Hamas had won those elections a month ago? Not today, but a month ago. In Gaza.
In Gaza, good, thank you for clearing, okay? In Gaza, people are fed up with Hamas. Because since 2006, 2007, when they orchestrated their military bloody coup against the Palestinian Authority, we've been subject to collective punishment policies from Israel and from the Palestinian Authority and from Egypt. Egypt closed the border with Rafah, only opens it for humanitarian relief. Israel has declared in the Knesset that Gaza is foreign, Gaza is enemy entity, and imposed on us in Gaza very restrictive siege to the extent that they were counting the rations for individuals in Gaza, how many they need to eat, okay, this how much we'll allow in. Our only electric generation plant in Gaza was bombed by the Israeli F-16s following the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit. So for the past 16, 17 years, we don't have regular electricity in Gaza. It comes and goes, maybe 4 or 5 hours a day. Therefore, there is no drinking water and running water in the house because it depends on electric.
So if you had to guess, and I think what you wanted the clarification is Palestinian people are fed up with both Fatah because of its corruption or perception of its corruption, and with Hamas because of its destruction and oppression. Hamas controls Gaza already for over 15 years. It violently did a coup, which I do want you to speak to. You were about to speak about that. And then Fatah has controlled the West Bank. And I think what you were going to say is the Palestinian people will vote both of them out of power if they could. Am I right or wrong? Because you're not happy.
Yeah. So you know, in the West Bank, you know, Palestinians accuse the Palestinian Authority of nepotism. They accuse it of corruption. They accuse it of military coordination with Israel. They accuse it of giving up the fighters of Hamas and Jihad al-Islami and others to Israel. So yes, there are elements in the West Bank who are not Fatah, who don't support the Palestinian Authority. There are Hamas, there are Jihad, there's PFLP in the West Bank, and those ones want to do according to the platform of their movement. The platform of their movement supports violence and supports military operations. They have a military wing that is very active, and as you know, when you have a state, you must have monopoly over power. That's your job. So the Palestinian Authority is trying to have monopoly over weapons, over power, and don't want these groups to be running in the streets having guns. So there is a friction to the extent that the Jihad al-Islami and the Palestinian Authority fought it off during the first week or before this terrorist attack in Israel. So the people in the West Bank, they want to change Fatah, and the people in Gaza want to change Hamas. both for their own reasons. The people in the West Bank.
If I force you a little bit more to tell us, you and I spoke about this recently. Explain and Nimrod, I'm sure I'm going to get to in a minute. The people in Gaza consist of refugees and non-refugees. Could you explain a little bit about their different stances?
Yes. So the population of Gaza right now stands at 2.3 million. 1.3 are refugees. They're not Gazans. They are from the envelope of Gaza, and they are the refugees and the sons of the refugees from Gaza envelope, from Ashdod all the way to Yevna. Okay, they came to Gaza and they stayed. There's like 10 or 12 refugee camps for them. The refugees have different agenda than the natives of Gaza. Personally, I'm the product of both. My father is a native Gazan from Betlehem, and my mom is a refugee from the Galil, from Sfat. So I understand both mentalities.
I think with Nimrod, you want to clarify how they see refugees. Is that what you wanted to do?
I wanted to ask to very authentically, if 75 years after the foundation of Israel, can you still call yourself a refugee if you have two generations settling in one place?
Just to clarify for anybody that's listening from us, from the Palestinian perspective.
Yes, you can, Nimrod, because you were a refugee for 2,000 years. And you came back to establish a state after 2,000 years. And for those
I want to explain it to our viewers.
May I lose my right hand if I forget Jerusalem? Okay, so it's the same thing with Palestinians. They are refugees, my friend, until the problem is solved.
Just to educate our audience what is happening, from the Nimrod Israeli perspective, the concept that a refugee is defined as somebody that escapes war for that one person. It doesn't transfer to the next generation. For the Palestinian people, refugees are not just the people that escape, but all of their descendants for however long it takes. And the reason why this matters a lot is that ultimately, if you're going to resolve the conflict, and I don't think Ezzeldeen believes that all of the refugees are going to take over Tel Aviv, because he's a
of course. I believe in two-state solution and compensation.
So explain how do you, because this is a very, we should go back to what you were explaining before, but just since we got here, how do you reconcile the fact that you very proudly consider yourself a refugee and you do not want to, you're a Palestinian person first and foremost, and that's why we work with you. We don't want to work with people that don't care about their people's rights. Just like with Nimrod, we don't want to work with an Israeli that doesn't represent their national rights.
Yes.
How do you reconcile, though, the belief in a reconciliation and a solution for both peoples with the fact that you will never give up your refugee rights?
It happened that 4 months ago, I had the chance to go back to Safad, and to go to the neighborhood where my grandfather Nuruddin Ayyub house used to stand. It was very sad moments for me standing there and recalling how my mother family and my mother were driven out barefoot into Lebanon and having to live in refugee camps. It was a very sad experience for me. That said, I don't call for the complete return of 6 million Palestinian refugees into Sfat and Tel Aviv and Ramat Gan. I call for a two-state solution in which these refugees are compensated for their property. Just like how the Jews who left Egypt and Iraq and Yemen should be compensated for their property. And a Palestinian state built, and those refugees given Palestinian citizenship. And most of them, the majority, are absorbed in Palestine with cities. That's how I see this happen.
I think just to clarify, because among our listeners, there will be people that don't have the complexity of understanding. What you're saying and the way I'm understanding it is there's a moral right that you don't want to be robbed from because your ancestors were during the 1948 war, presumably, or at some point, were driven from living in the area of Tzfat down to Gaza, and you do not want to abandon the moral right, but you're willing to find a way for that moral right to be resolved through a solution where both the Israeli and the Palestinian people build in peace with one another, and in exchange for building a Palestinian state and some sort of negotiated compromise, you would respect the right of Israelis to live in Israel. And I think this is a very, very important point, because a lot of people like Jewish people, my father was a Holocaust survivor, when we hear the Palestinians will never give up their refugee rights, we're like, well, they want a destruction of Israel. They're never going to accept. We cannot allow 6 million or 2 million or 1 million Palestinians coming back to, Jaffa and Tel Aviv and Tzfat and stuff. And what you're saying is, what would be the practical solution in your perspective?
What I'm saying is the practical solution for those refugees is to be compensated for their property loss. That's number one. Number two, once we have a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders and land swap to accommodate facts built underground, once we have that state, then Palestinians from all around the world have the right of return to Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza.
Will be the Palestinian state.
Yes.
Because some people say Palestine and they refer to the entire thing, and that
No, I don't refer to the entire thing. Palestine is the West Bank.
But it's important. It's important for audience to understand that when people are marching and saying "Free Palestine from the river to the sea," what they're saying, and this is a significant portion, and this is very dangerous. They're absolutists that are actually going to end up achieving nothing for the Palestinian people, because Israelis are never going to allow the replacement of their state. There's one Jewish state across the world, and Israelis are always going to fight that. And people that are absolutist on either side are actually condemning their people to a horrible situation. Ezzeldeen, Nimrod, and I recognize the right of both peoples to freedom, dignity, respect, security, and to finding some sort of compromise. And people that are saying from the river to the sea, from the Israeli or Palestinian side, are actually shackling us with a conflict forever. So if you hear people saying from the rivers to sea, are you saying that you don't want the other side to have a homeland? Because if there are people that say we must replace Israel with Palestine, and they might just say free Palestine, and say, what do you mean by that? If they say from the river to the sea, they're saying they don't want Israel to exist. They're extremists, because and extremism has consequences. They're denying the Palestinian people, like Ezzeldeen, who are practical, who want a future, the ability to actually build a solution, because nobody's going to ever shoot themselves. Israelis are never going to allow for those extremists to replace Israel. And so they're literally out of the comfort of their BDS offices in Berkeley, California, calling for an absolute solution that's literally denying people on the ground a practical solution. Is that fair, Ezzeldeen?
Yeah, because in California, he wakes up and he goes to Starbucks, okay, and he has his coffee, okay, in the comfort of living in California. And he can afford that, but we can't in the occupied territory. We wake up to a military occupation. We wake up to checkpoints. We wake up to settlers violence. That's why we want an end to the occupation. That's why we want two-state solution. That's why we're willing to accept a compromise.
Go back to when I derailed you with our conversation. You said 2.3 million Gazans.
Yeah.
50% are what you guys call refugees, which are people that came from outside Gaza, and 50% are originally from there. And it sounds like your name is Ezzeldeen Masri. Masri means the Egyptian.
Yes.
But you're not Egyptian, or you came from Egypt, or your ancestors?
Yes. So as you know, okay, during the Ottoman period, there was no barrier between all these countries.
The Ottoman period is in the 19th century, when the Turks, are now Turks, controlled all of the Middle East. Keep going. Yeah.
So, it was a free movement. And yes, my ancestors come from Egypt, approximately roughly 300 years ago. Two brothers left Egypt when they were digging the Suez Canal, and they didn't want to die digging in the desert, and they headed east. And they arrived to Beit Lahia. It was sand dunes, and they settled.
And Lahia is part of Gaza.
Yeah, in northern Gaza. And now the Masri family is the biggest family in Beit Lahia. Yes. And when it comes to refugees in Gaza and natives in Gaza, as I said earlier, 2.3 million, 1.3 are refugees from the areas of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Yevna, and Kfar Azza and all that area. And they still live in the refugee camps. For example, Jabal refugee camp, Daniel, we went there, me and you. Okay, so they've been there for the past 75 years, and they identify themselves as refugees, and their agenda is different than the agenda of natives, like from my village, Bet Lahia. Because in my village, Bet Lahia, and my village, the village next to us, Bet Hanun, and the village of Jabalia, these are the three villages in northern Gaza. It consists of small villagers, known families in the village. They are landlords. They have land. They cultivate their land. Mostly used to be citrus trees and lemon. And they're interested in building their life, educating their kids, engage in business like normal native people. That's their agenda. They want to live. On the other hand, you have refugees who look to the east and to the north, and they see their villages, and they cannot go to it, and they live miserable lives in Gaza, and they have kids, and these kids are fed breastfed milk, and in the same time they were fed the idea that you are not Gazan, you are a refugee, you are from El Mijdal, which means Ashkelon, or Zdud, which means Ashdod, and we live here temporary, and we're going back to our homeland. And when they go through the UNRWA school and other schools, they are taught also by refugees. I went to refugee school in Jabal refugee camp. My father was a teacher and did headmaster in Al Fakhura school, and they are taught by refugees. The history teacher is a refugee, the geography teacher is and they tell them, you are not from here. So this is emphasized, this idea that you're not from here, we're here temporary, we're refugees, and we're going back.
Within the people from the Gazans that are originally from Gaza, what percentage directionally would support Hamas versus other groups? And then within the refugees, what percentage directionally would support Hamas?
The refugees are more militant than the natives because they have agenda. The natives, he wakes up, he wants to provide water for his citrus trees, he wants to buy fertilizers, he wants to go to the market and sells his apples. The refugee, he lives a miserable life in a refugee camp. You're talking about maybe 20 families living in 1 or 2 rooms, sharing bathrooms and kitchens, very miserable conditions, open sewage. And they wake up cursing the world, cursing Israel, cursing everybody around the world. And when a state like Iran comes in and gives him money and gives him AK-47 or RPG or what kind of weapons there is, that refugee is more is going to take the money and they're going to take the weapon and go fight Israel because he has an agenda and he was raised that Israel took your land and you need to fight.
So practically, do you think that it's at all possible, because from what you're saying, it is possible to achieve an agreement with the original Gazans who want a better future, but the refugees are just going to want to replace Israel? What would it take to make the refugees be part of the solution? And let's say you had a government in Israel that was willing, like Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert and others before them, that offered a peace agreement, which was, you can argue, not perfect, but we're trying to get a resolution. What would it take to get the refugees to be part of the solution? What would you do?
So I left Gaza in 1990. May 1990. At night, I was spray painting PLO and hanging flags. And around 12 o'clock at night, my father took me in his car to Ben Gurion Airport with his friend. He dropped me off one-way ticket, Air France, came to Chicago. And I went back in 1997 to visit after I finished my bachelor degree. I wanted to go visit and see how is Gaza. Now there is a Palestinian Authority. Daniel, people just were happy that the Israelis have left. Now there is a Palestinian Authority, Palestinian flags, Palestinian police. They talk about Palestinian state. People were excited. I went back also to visit in 2000 when I finished my master's degree. I volunteered with the foreign ministry. Yasser Arafat was negotiating in Camp David, and the spirit was we done. We got it. Okay, negotiation. Arafat gonna come with a Palestinian state. Israel gonna recognize us first. America gonna recognize us second. There was this euphoria among Palestinians that we're gonna have a state. I experienced it, and back then also refugees were happy. Okay, that we are going to have a state. We are going to get out of the refugee camps. Maybe some of us will be transferred into new cities in the West Bank. Maybe we'll be compensated for our money. So there was acceptance even among refugees. When there is hope, when there is hope, when there is light at the end of the tunnel, and when you are in a miserable condition, okay, you would love that hope, okay. And but when there is no hope at the end of the tunnel, then things get complicated, and it's fertile ground for radicalism and extremism. And that's what's happening in Gaza. You have people situated, refugees, poor, subject to Israel blockade and Egypt blockade, poor condition. And then you have country like Iran coming in 1979 when the Iranian revolution erupted with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and saying we are going to export the revolution to all these Arab countries. Okay, it changed the regimes in Saudi, Bahrain, etc. And then they went and adopted the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. It became Hamas later on, and they funded with millions of dollars. You're talking about Hamas and Jihad al-Islami combined, they get around $50 million a month for their budget from Iran. And that is serious money. And that's how Hamas and Jihad al-Islami first started as social movement, helping people with food rations, with water, with medicine. And this snuck in. And first, when the Muslim Brotherhood was in Gaza, it wasn't a violent group. Actually, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, which I know personally, the founder of Hamas, he was my teacher in 4th grade. He taught us religion in Maruf al-Rasafi school.
Yassin was your teacher?
Yeah, he was a teacher. They used to bring him in a blanket.
Your teacher?
Yes, Ahmed Yassin was my teacher in Maruf al-Rasafi school. And I got hit by him like this on my hand when I was in 4th grade. Because
is that why you became a moderate? Because he hit you as a student?
Because I did not memorize the Quran. I did not memorize a couple of verses. I was maybe in 4th grade or 3rd grade. He told me, put your hand like this. And he hit me.
Yassin was a cleric that was one of the founders of Hamas that was, if I recall correctly, assassinated, correct?
Yes. Yeah, he was a sales advisor.
And he was one of the founders of Hamas. And from my narrative, very radical. Was he, having met him, was he...
He was young. He was young. He was maybe in his late 20s, maybe. Yeah, when I met him.
He didn't indoctrinate you? How come you ended up being a man, as Palestinian nationalist as you are, a man of peace, as opposed to people, partly it's the refugee versus non-refugee, but what else happened where you saw this has to be respecting the humanity of all sides and we need a practical solution rather than the Starbucks progressive all or nothing eternal hatred solution? What happened with you?
What happened with me, if it was left to my mom, I would have become radical, because my mom is a refugee, and she used to tell me growing up, the Jews are thieves. They took our house, they made us refugees, and the Jews are weak because they are cheaters. You are stronger than them. You have a valid point. They don't. That was my mother. She prayed all the time and fasted. She's a devoted Muslim. My father wasn't. My father was a socialist, progressive. My father also supported two-state solution. He was active with the People Party.
Your parents still alive?
My father passed away. My mother is still alive. Yeah. And my father, basically, he educated me on this, and he won me to the side of being socialist, being progressive, and staying away from radicalism and going to the mosque and being indoctrinated by Hamas. He made that a point. He didn't want me to be indoctrinated by Hamas.
You said that even when there was hope around the years in the mid and late 90s and prior to the Second Intifada, that even the refugees had hope. But did your mom have, she was ready for a resolution?
She was ready. She was ready. And others too, refugees. They were ready. Yes, but Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat would have said, boom, bam, bam. Okay, that's it. We follow him.
Why did Yasser Arafat turn his back on, I mean, even if the Hood Barak's offer was not what he wanted, the narrative from my people was he got offered a deal And instead of accepting it or saying, let's stay on the table, he then endorsed the violent intifada, and that derailed us. Why, what happened?
I told you I was in Gaza during the negotiation. I was, volunteering with the foreign ministry. So I was following up. And then I had to leave. I had to come back to Chicago. And on my way back in Cairo, I seen the news papers in red, the failure of Camp David negotiation. I felt sick to my stomach. Okay. Yasser Arafat refused the offer basically because Yasser Arafat he felt that he made a historical concession. He gave up on 70, 4% of Palestine, and he gave up on the right of return and all these cities, and he
accepted historic Greater Palestine.
Yeah, he accepted 22%. He accepted 22%.
And but why?
Sorry, Ezzeldeen, I want to pause on this moment because a lot of people don't understand it when they talk about the conflict. This is a story about shitty winners and shitty losers in the end. And when Israel won the 48 war, its independence war, what we call, and the 67 war, we basically controlled 100% of the territory of what we
1967. And the plus. You had the Sinai and the Golan.
And Sinai and everything in Golan and so on. And when we approached the Palestinian conflict, we basically, for many years, even the initial discussion in Israel was right after the 6-day war, after the 67 war, was we need to give up the territory, part of the territory, to give them back some of their land, because we can't control everything. You can't control 100%. And for the average Palestinian, and this I'm saying in Israeli, we took all your land. And now when we go for a compromise, someone needs to compromise. Either the winner compromises, or the one who lost the war compromises. And it's very hard thing to both sides to do, because the winner wants to take it all, and one who lost wants to minimize his losses. So when Palestinians signed the Oslo Accords, they basically gave up a lot of their demands. And that's something people need to respect when you come to the discussion with Palestinian as an Israeli.
In a future session, we can go back to a little bit of the history. I find that a lot of my Jewish and Arab friends spend a lot of time litigating how we got here in terms of the history. I think it might be slightly helpful, but at the end of the day, we need to figure out where we're going from here. Yes. So I think in future sessions, we should provide a history of the facts, because there's a lot of misinformation, and we should share a little bit about the facts, but we should also share a little bit about where do we go from here, because I think the hopelessness right now is so high, and it's going to derail us. And the danger is that absolutist visions reinforce one another, right? Like when you have Hamas achieving the horrible atrocities that it did on the Israeli people, and then from my narrative, the Israeli government having no option but to counterattack, to stop the rockets from flying, to liberate its hijacked citizens, and to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure so this doesn't happen again. And one of the debates that I want to have with you, because you and I were exchanging WhatsApps, Ezzeldeen, is you were advocating for a ceasefire to me, and I'm like, but what do you mean a ceasefire? How are you going to ultimately not just prevent this from happening again, but liberate the Palestinian people from the yoke of terror of Hamas? And I think in a future conversation between us, we should talk about what is the solution out of there, because I don't see how every few years Hamas starts a war funded by the Iranian regime, which is trying to derail efforts of progress between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And then the Israelis have this debate, should we go in, should we not go in? I don't have moral qualification to answer that, because I'm not the one having to go in. I don't have children that have to risk their lives. But strategically and morally and legally, I don't understand how you build a better future for the Palestinian people and the Israeli people without dismantling the terror infrastructure that Hamas had built, because otherwise you're just going to make it worse a few years from now. You're sparing yourself from horrible pain. Go ahead, Nimrod.
I said just on the Israeli perspective, you can't have random groups holding arms which are not the Palestinian Authority. And even the Palestinian Authority, there is a legal framework of what type of monopoly they have over power. The moment that you have Hamas, which is also, it's against Israel, or you have the Jihad Islamic, or any other organization taking up the arms, which is not a Palestinian Authority, Israel must fight it, because these are illegitimate forces in our perspective. And even more than that, I think that in the end, the goal is to have a pragmatic solution for the situation. And if you have non-pragmatic sides that also hold arms and willing to use it against anyone, with no regards to moral rights, Israel is in a very problematic position. We can't let it happen. And I think one of the tragedies of the past, decade or so, or 20 years, when the moment Hamas took control over Gaza, and Israel did not dismantle it right away, we basically helped weakening the Palestinian Authority and weakening the actors themselves.
Listen, we've run for quite a while, and I think we didn't even cover 1% of your story, Ezzeldeen, of what you went through. Nimrod, understand what Darkenu is doing on the ground.
And it's even a bit more than that. But Daniel, I want to do emphasize, because this is the part where most Israelis, I think, agree with most Palestinians. You can't have random violence, and you can't have factions which use violence with only the Palestinian Authority should have the ability to use force.
That your prime minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who used the appeasement policy like Churchill did with Hitler. Okay,
I'm not a friend.
Ezzeldeen is saying, just to educate the audience, Ezzeldeen is saying that Netanyahu had a policy to try to appease Hamas, and there was a very uneasy and weird relationship and dynamic when Hamas and Likud would strengthen one another with their or the extremist parties of Itamar and Ben-Gvir. We haven't even gotten to any of that. I think we need to pause here, and we will cover a little bit more of what Darkenu and Nimrod's work on the ground to help the victims of terror. We'll cover a little bit more about Ezzeldeen's background. And if you guys are willing, we should do this again. And I apologize, we barely covered 1% of what we should be covering.
Of course, yeah, we'll do it again. Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap up here, and please follow this channel. I don't even know what, whoever is listening, please join us. And I promise you, we're going to try to give you not just a lot more authentic conversations and background, but also constructive ways out of this mess.
Yes.
Ezzeldeen, Nimrod, thank you for investing the time. Nimrod, sorry that we spent most of the time.
We'll get more. It's not going to be the only time we're going to speak. You have a Jewish Israeli, and you have a Muslim Palestinian from Gaza working together, okay, for a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians. We are there to stay both, the Israelis and the Palestinians, between the land, between the river and the Mediterranean. This belongs to Jews and Palestinians.
Bezrat Hashem, inshallah, God's will prevail on what you just said. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, love you guys.